Welcome, folks. And we're just gonna, yep, thank you for muting that person. Okay. Friends, we're here today to think in advance about something we hope we don't encounter, and that is, what if things get out of hand at protests or other large-scale gatherings, especially as we get closer to the election. We've covered a lot of protests over the last few months, so we have a lot of firsthand knowledge and experience on this. And it's not that our knowledge and experience only goes back these last couple of months. We've done a lot of things. We've been in war zones. We've covered all sorts of conflicts on our own shores. But I think we all know that what we're going through as a country right now is more comprehensive. It's more widespread. It's different than it was before. And so we've done some things with Garrett Jaco, who I'm going to introduce you to here in a minute, working with reporters on ways to maintain safety. To not get themselves in difficult situations, to be able to do their jobs the best they can, but not put themselves at risk of injury or anything like that. And we're wanting to talk to you as managers, as editors, about your role in that. So this is going to have a lot of overlap with the training that we've done for reporters and photographers, but you have a special responsibility as the people sending folks into coverage scenarios where, and we're going to talk a little bit about the bird's eye view that you have and some of the things that we're going to ask you to be thinking about. Of course, with our employee safety being far and away the #1 most important concern that we have. So Garrett Jaco is in charge of security at Gannett. Garrett is a certified federal hostage negotiator. Garrett was in the Marine Corps, combat veteran from Ramadi in Iraq. He's seen a lot. He's done a lot, and he understands through his personal experience and through his training how to stay out of trouble and how to get out of trouble. So we're going to organize our conversation today in 4 different sort of periods of time. Before you send a reporter or photographer into a situation, during the situation as you understood it to have been unfolding, what happens if and when things change, and after the situation. So it's a conversation that I will lead with some questions to Garrett, but all of you are welcome to join in and ask any questions that you want of Garrett, whether they follow the pattern that I just outlined or not. You can use the chat, you can speak up on the mic, whatever you need to understand and know and keep your reporters as safe as possible. So Garrett, let's start out by talking about before we send a reporter or photographer into a potentially dangerous situation. I know that there are some very simple techniques like the buddy system, like some communications protocols, et cetera, that reporters and editors can agree on ahead of time to make sure that we're doing our best. Walk us through some of those, if you would, please.
Yeah, I think the first thing that we should talk about is having a talk between the reporters that we're going to send out to cover a story and the editor that they're reporting up to. And some things that we should talk about are, what kind of event is it? I mean, it's very different if you're going to cover protests that we don't think anyone armed is coming to. It's going to be a small protest. It's not intended to move. Versus, you know, something like we've seen in Louisville, where we expect armed individuals to be there. They expect the protest to be a moving protest. So really talking about the event itself, what we're expecting, and then have an agreed upon, you know, you call that a comm plan, but I'll call it a check-in plan. There should be set amount of times in between when you talk to the reporters we have out in the field or that they communicate to you. And that time is going to vary depending on, again, what the situation is we're going into, but it should be an amount of time that allows them to do their job, allows them to really monitor the situation, see what's going on, but not too long of a time to where you haven't heard from them for hours, you don't know if they're okay. But when you're talking about a check-in, you should have an agreed upon amount of time and how you're going to do it. You know, whether that's an email, whether that's a text, whether that's a phone call, it should be agreed upon. And then if we as leaders haven't heard from them in that amount of time, we should be reaching out to them. You know, it could be that they forgot They've got tunnel vision, they're reporting, and they just lost track of time. But we want to ensure that we're abiding by that agreed upon check-in time. And then we also need to have, when you're talking about communication, a plan for, okay, if something happens and you lose your buddy, where are you going to meet them at? You know, that all goes into a plan. It's not, well, we were in a buddy system and Mackenzie and Garrett are now 4 blocks away. We'll find each other at some point. It should be, okay, if we get split up, we're going to fall back to this area, or, you know, a secondary point is this area. We'll regroup and then we'll go back in and continue coverage of the event. And then the last thing, when you're talking about communicating with the individuals that we're sending out, we should have a drop dead time. If we haven't heard from you in 4 hours, we will constantly call you until we get a hold of you, or we will start calling other reporters or photographers that we have in that area to start looking for you. That way we have at least an agreed upon time that we're going to start looking to make sure you're okay, versus, oh, we'll figure this out tonight once the coverage is over.
That's great. Garrett, on the sort of communication protocols, talk us through ways that editors can do a threat assessment of any given situation. In other words, what's happening on Tuesday and what's happening on Wednesday aren't always the same thing. This particular issue is more radioactive than this other, et cetera. So what are some of the sort of checklists that would go through an editor's mind in that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think as editors, you all have a unique perspective. Most of you have contacts within the city government or within the communities that can provide additional information that, you know, at a national level, we're probably not seeing. So ensuring that you're reaching out to those contacts and going back to kind of what we talked about, who's attending. I'll use Louisville again. You know, Wednesday night may not be as bad as Friday night when we expect individuals from out of state were coming in. You know, so if we expect a local community gathering, we don't expect many armed individuals. We're expecting it to be a small gathering. All of those go into that threat assessment. You know, the number of people that are there, who's coming, the intent. I mean, sometimes you can just hear chatter that the intent is to not be peaceful. So if the intent is going to play out on that. So those are some things we can think about. And then what time of day it is. You know, if we're covering stories during the day, that's a different threat level than covering them at dark or at dusk. You know, each of those increased risk. And the later in the evening, statistically, is when crime will rise or violence will rise. So, you know, you need to play each of those into threats, and then it needs to be continuous. We might send Mackenzie and Emily out to cover a story at noon today, and something happens between noon and 3, and that has changed, which then changes the threat. You know, if by chance there was a shooting in between that time, or fights broke out in between that time, that's going to change the response from both protesters and both law enforcement, which will change the threat assessment of that event.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about during the event. And this is not an event that's escalated beyond what we planned for. It's an event that's taking place pretty much as predicted. I want to talk about tactics and positioning of our individuals and our teams, and how that relates to an exit plan. So Garrett, I've heard you say before, if you only have one exit, then you have no exits. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, so when you're going into a situation, it goes back to prior to getting in there and after you've had your talk, you as a reporter or you as a leader should ensure your reporters and photographers have a plan. You know, where are they going to park their car? Where are they going to enter the area that they will be covering? And then once they enter, they should have an escape plan. And as Mackenzie said, if you have one, you have none. And if you've ever flown on a plane, they tell you to find the two safest or the two closest exits. And that's really because if one's blocked, we want to make sure that our employees have another safe avenue to exit out of harm's way. So as you go in, you set up wherever your initial spot is, you should scan the area, keeping your head on a swivel to, hey, here's, I could go straight across the street, head down 3 blocks and turn right, and I can be back to safety. Or if I just make a right here and go 3 blocks, I'm back in safety. That's your initial starting point. But if that, if we plan on this being a march and you were constantly moving with the march, you need to constantly reassess where your exits would be. And then throughout the event, as I said a minute ago, keeping your head on the swivel, because just because those are safe exits at noon doesn't mean at 12:30 or 1 o'clock, those same exits are still your most viable, safe ways out. Police presence could have shifted to where you couldn't get through there. Roadblocks could have been put up. Demonstrators could have moved positions. So we want to make sure that you're constantly reevaluating where your safe exits are based on the current events within that situation.
Yeah, obviously all positions are relative to the other positions and how open or safe or not they are. What about, Garrett, as of course things escalate and they change, and these are volatile situations, and so sometimes the threat becomes greater than we estimated. And so I want to get into a couple of different things that editors can do. One is from the bird's eye view that they have, and another is things that they can prepare their journalists to be on the lookout for and be feeling for. So let's first talk about the bird's eye view. As an editor, you're not on the street in the same way that the reporter is, but you have access to the police scanner, you have access to other news sources. You can be making calls and doing reporting of your own out of the glare of the situation. You might have some critical information that the reporter needs to move, or either to get into position or to get out of position. So Garrett, tell us a little bit about kind of what you think the person off the street's responsibility and contribution to the other person's safety they can make.
Yeah, I mean, you talked a little bit about it and hit some major points, but it really is our job to provide the people who are able to listen to Police Scanner, watch live coverage on the television. You're going to get a view that myself or any of you that are standing on one street corner will not be able to see. So if you do hear over the scanner, over the police scanner, hey, we're going to move in, and shut down the protest, or we're going to send additional forces to this location, or you hear that 2 blocks over, demonstrators are becoming more aggravated, or they're starting to throw things, or they're starting to conduct property damage, then those are things we should be relaying to our reporters so they know, okay, if we're going 2 blocks over, our risks are increasing because 2 blocks over is a different situation than right here where it's still currently peaceful. Or if I'm walking with protesters down the street and I know the police are about to move in the opposite way, I may want to duck into a side street and cover that story at a 90-degree angle versus head on. And that goes back to positioning that we just talked about, having a 90-degree angle, not right in front of the protesters or right in front of law enforcement, and still being able to see what's going on is usually the safest area. You're not going to get trampled from either side, and it allows you a little leeway to back out if you need it.
Mm-hmm. That's good. And backing out, I want to talk about. So I know that all of you know this, but I just want to say it for the record. We don't expect a journalist to put him or herself in harm's way. The valorous thing is to withdraw and get to higher ground, get to safe ground. So let's talk about what happens when things get even more gnarly than we thought. Garrett, one of the things that that police forces who are increasingly militarized are doing is they're doing military maneuvers, pincer maneuvers, enveloping maneuvers. And these are things that on the street we can see and feel if we're looking for them. What are they? How do we feel them? And how do we retreat outside of them?
Yeah, so I'll start with, we just talked about if you're hearing police movement, but if you're down on the ground, you will be able to see a shift in posture, right? If you see law enforcement starting putting on their gas masks, or if you see different people coming up to the front line than who's been there all day. You know, if you've had plainclothes police officers with no riot gear on, and now people would just, even if it's just the shin pads on, like we've already elevated the police response. What most law enforcement will do is, depending on where you're set up, is kind of make an L shape. That way they can push you in the direction they want you to go. And that L shape then allows no one to get through what lines they're creating. But what I would say is, oftentimes on both sides of the issue, you know, if you're in the protest or if you're on the law enforcement side, you'll be able to sense that natural tension go up. And it's not usually from 0 to 10, it's 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, and so on. And, you know, you start with screaming that wasn't there, or if everyone was talking and now it's quiet. You know, if you see a sudden change in the reaction from either side, that tells us it's time to be prepared for the situation to develop. Whatever that develops into, that might change, but you are going to see something change as people's responses to each other change. And at that point is when you don't have to go back completely out, but we should be looking for a safe spot where you and your buddy could get to where it's, okay, maybe we have a building on this side of us, so we're safe. We have a bus stop right here that provides some cover. And now we only have 2 ways that we really need to be watching to ensure we're safe for whatever's getting ready to happen.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I want to, the last thing in this timeline we want to talk about is after actions and debriefs, but we've talked a lot in intentionally military and tactical terms, because that's what these events are becoming. I want to stop and ask if anybody wants to follow up with any of these points. We've got Garrett here, or even share your experiences that you've had that can add to the discussion that's gone on so far.
Yeah, and Mackenzie, can I add one other thing? Just because we say back out doesn't mean you have to back out and stay out. Like, you can back out and then I don't want to say re-engage, but go back in to cover the story, you know? Mm-hmm. Let's say that they fired tear gas and we backed out because we needed to ensure the space was cleared out and air has got safer. And now you and your buddy have regrouped. You will go back in and cover that. It's not, hey, if I back out, I'm never going to get back in to cover that story. You can tactfully fall back and move back forward throughout the event to ensure that we're getting the coverage and you're staying safe.
Yeah. Mackenzie and Jacob, thank you for this. Being editor in Rochester, we had our share of experience last month. I live 150 yards from the public safety building, so I couldn't help but be out for many of the protests. And everything you described is the reality and what we've moved towards. The buddy system, the locations on the phone, tracking it, constant check-ins. The nights I wasn't out, I followed every tweet and message. We created a group message for the editors and the people who were out there. Things moved quickly. The first few nights when the police was much more confrontational, and you know, you turn away and then you look back and the police have moved or the protesters have moved, and it is tactical, it is situational, and you can't be looking at your phone and ignoring what's going on. I mean, we were pepper sprayed 4 times that night, the first night, the key is, and we did at one point get kind of trapped between the police and some of the protesters because there's an overpass and a highway and a river. And so we did it differently after that. I'm actually on a panel at Cornell with some of the Cornell Daily Sun people and some of the reporters, graduates of Cornell, were in the Oregonian, Wall Street Journal, been covering the protests. The one thing they point out is that you have to not surprise the cops, especially if it's a moving situation. You have to be alert, wave, make clear that you're the press in those situations. A Wall Street Journal reporter came around a corner and surprised the National Guard troops, and it got very tense. So the moving ones are almost trickier. And then the other part, though, is some protesters may start to focus on the reporters. And so what do you wear or not wear and when is a tricky part of it. I'd love to hear more about.
Yeah. So one thing we talked about a few months ago when we had this training was whether or not, you should wear a press ID or not. And what I said then, and I think it would hold true today, is if you don't feel comfortable, that's fine. But introducing yourself when you get on scene to law enforcement and letting them know, hey, this is what I look like. This is what, let's say we're all going to wear a blue shirt today to cover it or whatever, that you can wear something that at least you've made eye contact with whoever's in charge there, or one or two other officers there on scene. So like you said, they are not surprised, nor are they wondering who this person is. As Mackenzie said, I'm a federal law enforcement officer. I still have several friends in law enforcement. And one of the things I hear from them is, well, a lot of people have fancy cameras and a lot of people record with cell phones today. So, it is in their mind, like, who's a journalist or who's just out here taking photos and recording with their cell phone is becoming more and more blurry as they're pushing through in a moving situation. Like you said, it's much easier when we're all static and you can kind of see who's doing what. But once it gets to that situation where there's movement, it is nice that, you've already identified yourself. If you're not wearing your credential, or if you are, like, it's clearly visible. But yeah, running around a corner and running into law enforcement probably isn't the safest for the reporters. So that goes back to knowing where law enforcement has moved, making sure we're listening to the scanner. If we do have that outside information, letting them know. So we're just arming our reporters with all the knowledge we have.
And, there was a suggestion, Greg Burton made a suggestion in here about kind of goes along with Mike's point about, going up and identifying yourself or not surprising them. And Greg's even talking about calling ahead. Hey, here's who we are, what we're going to look like, where we're going to be positioned. Now that has its problems too. If part of what we're reporting on is police behavior, we know that this is a balance that we're doing all the time. There's another sort of nuance to this that I want to bring in Emily on as well. And so it's one thing to identify ourselves to the police and for all the reasons that we just discussed. It's another thing about what makes the most sense from a safety standpoint to identify ourselves to everybody else in the crowd. And so Emily, we've talked a little bit about the pluses and minuses. We could go as big as, wearing a bright neon shirt that says press, or down to no identification at all. And there's other points in between. Obviously, a lot of this is context dependent, but give us some thoughts there.
Well, I will say that some form of identification I certainly think is a best practice, and we have a process in place so that people can get those they look like backstage passes, kind of the hard lanyard type things that people can wear, and you can always tuck that into a shirt or a jacket. But when we've had journalists detained, it has been, we didn't see anything, we didn't know that you were a journalist. Of course they then say so, but we've made agreements. I mean, Detroit police every day send specific media credentials to their media partners with a date on them, and our journalists have those with them so that they can be identified as journalists. So I do think that's important. But then getting into, in some cases journalists have wanted to wear something more visible because they felt like they might be targeted along with protesters. So some sort of a bright, jacket or vest that says press. But in a lot of cases, they have not wanted to because they feel like that could make them a target in another way, either by police or by other protesters. And so we've, we think managers should talk to reporters and photographers about that, understand the comfort level. They're the ones out there and doing all of that. So we don't have any mandates around that. We just want to make sure they have what they need, but it definitely is dependent on the situation and the person's comfort level, because in some cases they feel it will separate them enough that they won't be a target, and in other cases they feel it will make them a target. And I think that there's definitely validity on both sides.
Got it. Thank you. Ginger Rao in Indianapolis, you're sharing a example over in the chat about how the situation moved and the lines moved on you, and that created some inconveniences, but ultimately it seemed like you chose the safest situation. Can you describe this scenario for us, please?
Yeah, it was the probably the third or fourth night of protest. I think it was either a Friday or a Saturday night. And it was the one night that they turned violent in Indianapolis, and we had 2 people who were killed overnight. The building, the windows were broken in, that kind of thing. We had 4 different teams in the field because we were already using the buddy system, and everybody was on a single group chat. So everybody got pinged at once with an update on location and where people were. And then we got a notification on Twitter from the police department that they were recommending that anybody who didn't have to be downtown vacate immediately due to the protests sort of devolving out of control. And so we texted the team and told them to, to get out of the field essentially, or retreat someplace. There was only, of the 4 teams, there were only 2 of them that were in a place where they felt like they were actually fairly safe. So they shared that location with everybody else. Everybody else retreated to that spot. So then we had all 6 or 8 of them together. But then we physically just could not move them from that location back toward the building and their cars in the parking garage and the newsroom, because where the worst of the violence was happening was actually right outside of the newsroom. So it would have put them in more danger to bring them in at that point. So we just made sure that we had the chat going. I kept my cell phone on, and we just kept a line open between 2 people in the field and 1 in the newsroom. And every time they felt like they could take, a few steps in a certain direction or kind of inch along a building and then go around a corner, they would let us know what their updated location was.
Great. Thank you for that, Ginger. And Rick Green from Louisville is on, and I think we've got his mic hot here. So Rick, I don't know that I would say Louisville's been the epicenter of many of these, but certainly one of the most important centers. So can you talk us through your experience, please?
Yeah, sure. It's good hearing you, Mac. Tomorrow night is the 22nd consecutive week of protests here in Louisville. It started the last Thursday in May, and every day, every night, we've had some type of marches. Some have been larger than others. Some have been national on scale and in terms of prominence, and others have been just a few dozen. And we've been out there every night except for 4 days, on 4 nights. That was the last week in June when a freelance photographer who was part of the marches and who was covering this for independent media sites was shot and killed. And it also happened to be one of the godson of one of my Metro columnists. We pulled everybody off the streets for those 4 days so that we could go through another layer of really intensive training with Garrett. And Garrett, I got to tell you, and just for everybody, these kind of sessions are really great to hear everybody's experiences, but for all the editors out there and leaders, Garrett really knows his stuff. And I hope that if you haven't tapped into it individually and to really talk about your specific situations, that you spend time, that you do that. I felt that we were being really thoughtful and careful and safety conscious throughout this whole process, but over the past 22 weeks, Garrett made us a lot better. So a great corporate resource that you all should really, really utilize. 2 quick things that I just want to say in addition to that. I'm like all of you guys, man. I love the story, right? We do everything we can to chase the story, and you're on the adrenaline and you're following it and you're doing all the things that we do. It is so important as leaders to be able to remind your team that's out there that their safety trumps the story. And that's hard. Sometimes that's hard. I've had a few folks who are just, safety to be damned, and let's go out and chase the story and get that great shot, that great video, whatever it might be. And you have to really run hard over them and pay close attention to every potential source of the action so that you know what's going on with those checks. Mike Killian, you talked about those frequent check-ins and everything. You just have to do that because circumstances can change so quickly. And even whenever you're really, really careful, to kind of speak to that, 3 weeks ago, when one of the protests came out after the Breonna Taylor indictment announcement was made, we had 3 photographers and a videographer following a group of protesters, and it was a relatively peaceful encounter. And they came up to the police, and it was fairly cordial. Within 3 minutes after that encounter, there were shots fired on the other side of the street aimed at the police, and our team was kind of caught in the middle of the whole thing, because while they were being conscientious, the thing can change in a second. And so one of the things that Garrett has been so great with us is keeping your head on a pivot and constantly being able to detect it when you can. And even if you can't, you got to be able to look for that exit route, because it could have gotten incredibly ugly really fast on so many different levels that night. Garrett's just been a really great resource, and I think all of us can learn from that. I don't think any of us expected when this year began that we'd be facing so many of the challenges that we all are. But man, it's important for us to try to learn from each other and keep reminding to our staffs that their safety trumps everything over this story.
Thank you, Rick. Rick mentioned a term that we've heard a couple of times here that Garrett has talked about: head on a swivel, head on a pivot, and its opposite is tunnel vision. And so let's, Garrett, in the heat of a highly contentious, high stress situation, tunnel vision, that's not just a cliche, that is a real affliction. That is a danger. It's your body's, it's the adrenal gland doing a thing to help you lock in and ignore everything else, but possibly at your peril. So this is something that maybe if you could help these editors understand sort of the physiological, what's going on here, and how to talk their reporters through knowing if they're in it and what the risks are and how to get out of it.
Yeah. So as it's called, it's tunnel vision. And I don't know if anyone ever remembers taking typing class or anything like that, but it's much like that. You get blinders on to where all you're seeing is what's straight in front of you. And it is your body's natural reaction to what's going on around you. And I will share a story that I shared on another call and Mackenzie's already heard. But when I was in Iraq, we were in a firefight, and all the training you can have in the world that, oh, you're going to get shot at, this is what's going to happen, this is how you respond. We were in about a 6-minute firefight, which is not very long. It seems like a lifetime. But 2 people down from me, there was a Marine that was injured and had screamed for help. A corpsman had gone over there, had fixed him, and they were evacuating him before me and the Marine to my left even realized that that was happening, which was about 3 minutes of us still being engaged in what our bodies felt was the immediate fear. So that's another part of having a buddy. If one of us are focused in on what we're seeing ahead of us or making sure that we're safe, that other person can be looking in a different direction, or not having to be looking down at a camera screen to see if the shot they got is good, or looking through it to make sure they're getting a good photo. That second person in your team should be the one not focused in on a general area or on a specific area. They should be scanning the crowd, making sure that they're picking up on the masses versus one specific detail that you are trying to capture, whether that be for a story or a photo, and you switch that back and forth. So the person who's focused can then relax their mind and do the general observations while the other person gets back to focusing. But it is hard. And when you're talking to reporters, it's going to happen. I mean, you can have all the training in the world, but when your body feels fear, it has that natural reaction. And so just be prepared to hear that during a debrief too, which we haven't talked about, that, hey, I didn't even notice this happen, or hey, I didn't even realize this, where you might be right next to them and have said, oh, for sure this happened. This is what I saw. So that's kind of something we should be prepared for and ready to talk with reporters about after the event happens.
Yep. And Garrett, we're going to talk about the debrief here in a moment. There's one other question that I want to tackle from the chat. John from Texas is asking about body armor, tactical gear, things like that. So this is something that we've considered, we've thought about. We actually have some equipment available and on standby, but our threshold for using it is pretty high. And I'm going to ask Emily to speak a little bit to this.
Yeah, we do have some equipment that we're able to deploy to sites, and people have asked some questions about it. It's another similar situation to things like press passes, that some people have said that they would want to be able to use that, and some people have said they're concerned that it would make them a target if they appear to be aligned with, you know, some of the more militant members of the protests or the police officers. And so, you know, reach out when there are specific equipment needs and that sort of thing. We certainly don't have enough to equip 5,000 journalists. And I think the guidance that Garrett has been talking about and Mackenzie throughout is really important, that we don't want our journalists to be in situations where they're going to need ballistic gear. It's very important, you know, certainly a bicycle helmet has been really good in case there's some sort of a projectile or something like that to have on hand, and those sorts of other things. But typically, if you're in a situation that would require you to need some sort of more military or police type gear, you shouldn't be in that situation. The story is not that important. The safety is much more important. And so we don't want people in the middle of dangerous situations, and especially thinking that they'll be more safe because they have this specific higher level of gear. And so again, that is available. We will outfit as needed, but it's more important to talk to people about, if you feel that you need this type of equipment, let's talk about what other precautions can be taken, or make sure that people are not in those situations that they would need it.
Okay, thank you for that. Now let's talk about the debrief, or to use the military term, the after action. Garrett, what's a checklist of things ranging from the common sense to maybe the things that we wouldn't think about? What do you want to do in a debrief after one of these high tension situations to learn from and do better next time?
Yeah, so the first thing is, and we'll start with some common sense here, is make sure everyone's safe and back. You know, we don't want to debrief and then realize 10 minutes later, oh, Mackenzie and Emily are still out. You know, so first thing is get a roll call of everyone who was out, make sure they're all back. And then, you know, the second thing is to be honest and have thick skin. And I know that's easier said than done, and being critiqued isn't always well received, but there are going to be things that when we have an honest debrief of, hey, we were out there and we noticed this, or, you know, we didn't hear from you for 45 minutes, or we thought this happened and we could have really used information if that was reported on TV or over the scanner. Not to take it personal, if we're hearing that from our reporters, that okay, that's learning to help us be safe next time. Okay, next time we'll make sure that, you know, we have a better plan around this. But we also have to be able to be critical of the staff we send out in the field. You know, if they come in and you haven't heard from them in 2 or 3 hours, and your agreed upon check-in was, hey, you're going to check in every hour, that needs talked about. And, you know, if we go back to our plan was, if we hadn't heard from you in 2 hours, we're going to have other reporters start going to where we last heard from you. Well, now you've taken away from those reporters' ability to cover the story, but now we've used resources to look for you. We're worried about you. We want to make sure you're safe. So next time we need to stick to the plan. So, you know, being honest about what went right and wrong within those hours is a huge part of it. And then also talking about what each other saw, because like I just said, my version of events from 2 blocks over may be very different than Mackenzie's version of events, whose are different than Rick's and Emily's and Mike's. So, you know, all of us were on teams that were in different places. So we saw events very differently, and we should be able to say, okay, well, this is what we saw going on. And what that's going to do is it's going to reinforce that not always within one event is it the same event at different locations within that. You know, I think Rick just talked about Louisville. In that case, it wasn't someone that was part of the protests that did the shooting, but it was aimed at law enforcement. So, you know, while our reporters that were right there saw a shooting, if you were anywhere else in the city that night, you would not have had that experience. So making sure that we talk through that, hey, these large events are different within there, I think just goes back to reinforcing why it's important to keep your head on a swivel. And it goes to show each other, okay, yes, this is your experience. That's not what we saw over here. Next time we cover, keep our head on a swivel because we might be in that location.
Thank you. That after action covers kind of the hours and a day after. There's also a lot that takes weeks to process in a high adrenal situation, and so we may only realize things later, or in the context of talking to it and thinking about it and reflecting on it. And also, these are traumatic things, and our brains put those things off until later at times. So what about after actions that are weeks later after the event? How would you design those conversations, Garrett?
Yeah, I mean, so, the farther away you get from an event, events are going to change in your mind. You'll clarify more details. Usually, your brain has had reasons, the ability to process that. So we, again, have that open, safe space to check back in with our employees, make sure we're using, resources from HR. We do have resources that employees could reach out and talk to. EAP, we've had them on site at Louisville or provided the number at Louisville. So ensuring that they understand the benefits or the resources that we as a company have is an important part of that, both in the hours after, but the days and weeks after, because just because you're not affected at midnight when you come off the street doesn't mean the next day or 2 days later, after I've had an ability to process all of the emotion and everything I saw, that now I won't need that resource, or now I won't have a different thing I would like to talk to you about. Mackenzie, 2 days ago, I said that I was fine and we did a great job, but looking back, we actually did miss a check-in time, and me and my partner got separated and we didn't have a great plan on how to get back together. And I would like to talk to someone about this. Okay, so let's go through those and address those one by one and make sure that we're providing a resource for them to speak to and providing feedback to them on how we can improve next time.
And it's our responsibility as leaders and managers to be open to the possibility that somebody may be enduring the effects of an event weeks or months later, and we need to help those people get to the help that they need. I put a link to a series of resources that we have about how journalists can help themselves and one another after having encountered trauma in the conduct of their job. That's not the EAP resources that Garrett was talking about. Those are professional psychological services. We have expanded our EAP trauma response over the last year. That's been an improvement in our benefits package. So there's an array of resources. And in fact, we have take a look in Network News tomorrow. We have a session coming up next week in conjunction with the Dart Center for Trauma and Journalism at Columbia University that we're going to be doing on Thursday of next week that should help supplement this. Other questions that folks have for Garrett or for one another, or any stories they want to share that they think could help the rest of the group?
Mackenzie, there was some chatter about exit polling, and I'm hearing that here from our reporters on the West Coast that they're concerned there's a lot of background noise about backlash from the public. Any thoughts on that?
Cheryl Sale, is it? I missed the. If this was in the chat, or is the chat or something you're picking up? You're in your own reporting.
Both. It's on the chat, and I'm hearing it from reporters that there's concern about violence election night and post-election.
Right. And I think I just saw the New York Times with a news story just today about armed intimidation at polling places and so forth. And so that's not just an issue for voters, it's if we're covering it. So Garrett, thoughts on Cheryl's scenario, which is not incomprehensible?
Yeah, I mean, we go back to employee safety is first and paramount. So if they are feeling, unsafe asking the question, or they're there and it looks like, you know, there's some armed individuals there trying to intimidate voters or even us, you know, take a step back, cover that story from the distance, and then let's report that up through headquarters and to local authorities as well. But I would just go back to specifically related to the polling, that would be our response. I will let everyone know that we as, you know, I work for Sam in the HR department, and we are planning on meeting regularly the week before the election and the week after election to make sure that as a leadership team, we are responding to any concerns that have come in from the field, whether that be employee concerns, whether that be injuries, whether that be building damage. So as a leadership team, we will be, you know, meeting regularly through that time to ensure we can quickly respond to incidents that come up. But I think the things we've talked about for covering a protest pretty much cover, you know, intimidate if you feel threatened at the polls as well while reporting.
Thanks for that question, Cheryl. I think that's on the minds of many, including myself. I went and voted yesterday, and happy to report it was a non-event. So I hope that that scene is repeated many millions of times. Others who have questions for Garrett or for Emily or for anybody else? Okay. Our journalists are quite obviously heroes all the time, but especially at this time. They're doing things under stressful circumstances, and it's our jobs to minimize the stress and maximize their security. So we have this resource in Garrett. We have an incredible resource in our collective experience, and we have probably the most important thing to lean on, which is common sense. If it doesn't feel right, don't do it. We can always cover the story a different way. We can never get somebody unhurt. So err on the side of caution, I hope, is a theme that's coming across loud and clear in this. Emily, is there anything you'd like to say as we wrap up and say goodbye?
Well, to someone's point, I mean, we're definitely having a lot of conversations right now looking at the election and what may happen as a result of that. We're going to be covering protests nationally and all that. You'll hear more from the elections team, but certainly you're the leaders in the company. You know, trust your gut, trust your instinct. Let's keep our people safe, keep surfacing questions up to us and reach out if there's any concerns or other things that come up. And we really appreciate your leadership on this. I know it's night after night after night, and that, you know, we've continued to provide great coverage across the company, and we've been lucky in that any injuries our journalists have suffered have been minor. And so let's continue to keep focus on employee safety and let us know how we can help and support in that.
All right. Thanks for your time, everybody. And Garrett, thanks for all you do for us.
Thank you, Garrett.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Emily.